welcome to a reader's history of science fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Episode 8, The Dawn of Cinema. Up until now, I've talked about the history of sci-fi almost exclusively in terms of books. This is because, well, partly it's because we've only covered up to the early 20th century, but also it's because this history is mostly defined by literature. You won't see Star Wars mentioned at all on the Wikipedia page for the history of science fiction, a fact that still surprises me, but you'll see lots and lots of books. Yet, it would be a mistake to simply gloss over the contribution that film made to the genre, even at this early stage, and indeed the contribution that science fiction made to film, too. It had a greater impact in later years, but adapting these stories to the visual medium absolutely brought in new ideas and new storytelling techniques, even some that can't really be done with the printed word. And that influence ran the other way, too. I think it's telling that so many of the earliest milestone films, the famous ones, were science fiction and horror. Maybe it was that the spectacle of the visual medium inspired filmmakers to push their limits. Maybe it was that film allowed them to do things that were impossible to do on a theatrical stage. I don't know if that was it in general, but it was definitely something that inspired the first great filmmaker, Georges Méliès. Georges Méliès was a French stage magician when he first saw a movie camera in action and was inspired to make films, and he brought all of his expertise to the art with both practical effects and camera effects to create worlds of fantasy on the screen. Though he made hundreds of short films in his career, his most famous was the first ever science fiction movie, the 17-minute feature Le Voyage dans la Lune, A Trip to the Moon, which premiered in 1902. This was a pretty big deal. Le Voyage dans la Lune is probably the earliest film that most people would recognize. You might know it from the famous image of the man in the moon with a spaceship stuck in his eye. Or at least it's the earliest fiction film people would know. The Lumière brothers' L'arrivée d'un train en gare de la Ciotat, The Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat Station, was technically a documentary. A 50-second long documentary. Le Voyage dans la Lune was not. It was loosely based on Jules Verne's From Earth to the Moon, and it features a group of scholars flying to the moon in a spaceship shot out of a giant cannon. Unlike Verne's story, though, the scholars actually reach the moon, where they are immediately accosted by aliens and have to escape from them. Unfortunately, this film was long thought lost. By World War I, Méliès was bankrupt due to a series of box office flops and bad financial decisions. Then, the French army confiscated many of his films for the war effort. Apparently, the celluloid used in film stock up to the 1950s also made excellent boot heels. It also didn't help that Méliès burned his studio in a fit of rage when his creditors finally repossessed it in 1923. But luckily, even in the earliest days, films were distributed as copies, including internationally. Even this didn't make it easy, but a partial copy of the film was found in 1929, and a better one in 1930, which became the standard version. The ending wasn't reconstructed until decades later, but they kept at it. Meanwhile, a copy of the hand-painted color version was found in a Spanish collection in 1993. I don't know how they could hand-paint 35mm film frames. It sounds like black magic to me, but they did it. Now, celluloid doesn't have a great shelf life, and the film was in such bad shape that they had to take it apart frame by frame and digitally reassemble it. About 10% of it had to be reconstructed from the black and white copies. But in 2011, Le Voyage dans la Lune was finally restored and re-released in Technicolor, at a cost of 20 times what it originally took to make it. Today, you can see both the black and white and color versions of this film for free on YouTube. It's a fun romp and nice and short, kind of like the old cartoons, so it's worth checking out. Do note that Méliès's films were so early in the history of cinema that they had neither title cards for dialogue nor an official musical score. They were meant to be shown with whatever music the exhibitor wanted, and sometimes a live narrator. So this means the modern music on the color version still counts as authentic. I wanted to tell this story because, for one, it's pretty cool, and because there are all kinds of crazy stories like this in the silent film era. And I'm hardly the only one who's noticed. For example, the 2011 film Hugo, and the book it was based on, is a very fun dramatization of the life of Georges Méliès. There's a lot more I could say here. It's a fascinating period. But this isn't a viewer's history of cinema, so you'll have to investigate that for yourself. Over in America, at the same time Méliès went bankrupt, Hollywood was getting its big break under the dubious pioneership of D.W. Griffith, but soon expanding to other studios. Hollywood's equivalent of the pre-Golden Age period in sci-fi literature was arguably the pre-Code era, before the 1934 Hays Code enforced rigorous censorship of perceived immorality in movies. The pre-Code era produced two classic sci-fi films, Frankenstein and King Kong. And there's one other film from back in the silent era that you'll want to know about, Metropolis, but I'm saving that one for last. 1931's Frankenstein and Dracula are probably the oldest talking films most people have seen. Frankenstein is of course more of a classic horror film alongside the likes of Dracula, the Mummy, the Wolfman, and so on, but it's as much science fiction as the book was, and I would argue just as foundational. However, Frankenstein is a weird one because the film is very different from the book. To start off, Henry Frankenstein and his hunchbacked assistant, Fritz, create the monster in an abandoned watchtower in Bavaria. The book, of course, has no Fritz, no castle or watchtower, no lightning storm, no shouting, "It's alive!" like a lunatic, no angry mob with torches and pitchforks, and Victor Frankenstein doesn't have family and friends who kinda sorta support his work, where Henry Frankenstein does. And of course, the book has an intelligent, well-spoken monster instead of a lumbering brute with a quote-unquote abnormal brain. But it turns out that a lot of these elements actually came from a source that I didn't even know existed until I was wrapping up the script for this episode. There was a stage play of Frankenstein performed in 1823, only 5 years after Mary Shelley published the book. And that stage play has Fritz the assistant, and the mute lumbering monster, and even Victor Frankenstein shouting, "It lives!" Mary Shelley even enjoyed the show, despite it being wildly different from her book. On the other hand, I was surprised to see the movie is also very different from the cultural depictions of the story I had imagined, because it turns out those mostly come from the sequels. Unlike those cultural depictions, the monster doesn't immediately turn on his creator, who is kind to him, but on Fritz, who abuses him for no reason. And the angry mob isn't a mob, but a legitimate posse to hunt the monster, led by Henry Frankenstein himself. And they only have torches. The pitchforks and other farming implements first appear in Bride of Frankenstein in 1935, and the iconic scene where the mob storms the castle to confront the monster's creator doesn't show up until Son of Frankenstein in 1939. Son of Frankenstein also introduced Bela Lugosi's Igor, spelled with a Y, as the new evil lab assistant, replacing Fritz, who died in the first film. There's not really a point to this, except to show how culture is built up over time, in bits and pieces, just like the genre of science fiction as a whole, and how this process may sometimes be lost in translation looking back. It's fascinating to see how things we take for granted like this today started out completely different. As for the movie itself, honestly, the writing isn't the best. Some of the scenes don't make a lot of sense in context. At least, the audience is asked to fill in a lot of gaps, things they could have included since the film is only 71 minutes. And the craziest part is that Henry Frankenstein comes off looking like a hero, even though he's the one who caused the trouble in the first place. Now, to be fair, it was Fritz's fault that the monster went on a rampage, but still, not having Frankenstein himself be the villain of the story kind of misses the point. And of course, the story wouldn't be complete without some early film-era weirdness. Even Frankenstein wasn't immune from the cutting room under the Hays Code, and a couple of the most shocking scenes, by the standards of the time, were cut and weren't rediscovered until the 1980s. Thankfully, cinema has gotten better at preserving its history over the years. King Kong, released in 1933, was a little different. Instead of a horror monster movie, it was the first major giant monster movie, and as such leaned much more toward a fantasy-adventure story. And by the standards of its time, it was fantasy rather than sci-fi. But just as Frankenstein is regarded more as scientific horror today, so too is King Kong scientific fantasy. Much like Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, it shows the fantastic, but not in a magical or mystical way. Indeed, the very real-world setting of New York makes it quite the opposite. So by today's standards, giant monsters are firmly in the sci-fi camp. And of course, King Kong spawned countless later examples of giant monsters. You probably know the rough outline of King Kong just like you do Frankenstein. The overly ambitious filmmaker Carl Denham recruits struggling actress Ann Darrow as the human interest for his secret project of filming an uncharted island. But things go wrong when Anne is kidnapped by natives and offered up as the Bride of Kong. Denham and Anne's lover, Jack Driscoll— why did all their names start with a D? Anyway, Denham and Driscoll save her from Kong and also manage to capture the giant gorilla to turn him into a Broadway show. Because capitalism. Cue the classic trope of the monster rampaging through New York. I thought this was a better movie than Frankenstein by a fair margin. It shows in the writing, which is quite a bit more solid, and I enjoyed the aesthetic. It's dated, yes, but it's well done. The Beauty and the Beast theme felt a little forced, but you had this very deliberate juxtaposition of the monster, something unknown and mysterious and powerful in the natural world, against the triumph of modern technology. The director, Marion Cooper, described it as, quote, a story of the primitive doomed by modern civilization. Like I said, dated, but it pulls it off well. And predictably, it was censored under the Hays Code, particular emphasis on the people getting eaten on screen. Although there's a more interesting story there. It turns out there was a deleted scene of a couple of the sailors getting eaten by giant insects and spiders on the island that was considered too much even before the code. That scene was never recovered. Finally, going back to Europe and a few years earlier, we have Fritz Lang's 1927 silent epic, Metropolis. Metropolis is probably best known today for the character of the robot Maria, but it is so much more than that. I'll say it right now, this is a cinematic masterpiece. I could tell from the very first scene, when the workers come trudging in, simultaneously looking like robots and like they're on a chain gang, that this was something special. It's not a popcorn flick. Metropolis makes you work, but not like Frankenstein does. It's a German expressionist silent film, which means it's steeped in symbolism, stylized depictions of emotions, and, in this case, religious imagery, too. It also makes very limited use of title cards. For most of the dialogue, you can see the characters' mouths moving, but you don't know what they're saying, and you have to fill it in for yourself. Yet, where I chalk Frankenstein's problems up to bad writing, for Metropolis, this is part of the performance art, and I think that makes all the difference. Metropolis resembles the classic dystopias we'll see in the next episode, especially Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, a mechanized society where people are just cogs in the machine being ruled over by an all-powerful state, although there are also marked differences from those stories. At the beginning of the movie, our hero, Fredder Fredderson, yes, really, lives a carefree life as the son of the city's ruler, but he is soon called by the human Maria to witness the plight of the workers who labor underground to keep the city running. Meanwhile, his father is determined to stamp out the seeds of rebellion he finds among the workers through a convoluted plot involving an evil robot double of Maria. Yet, for all this, it's not the socialist propaganda that you might expect at first glance. The messaging is far more nuanced than that. As the film itself describes, quote, the mediator between the head and the hands must be the heart. The head and the hands referring to the rulers and the workers of society, respectively. And that message was widely criticized at the time for being silly and naive. But you know what? It does a really good job of selling it. And in modern times, critics have come back around, as I did, to appreciating the film's examination of the impact of technological progress on society and its strong call for social change. There is so much going on here that I can't really do it justice. The sheer scale of the thing is incredible. Underground cityscapes that don't seem like they should be able to fit in a studio. Legions of workers on enormous machines. Massive flooded sets. A huge cast, or at least it did a good job of looking like it. And even an epic rooftop fight scene. The special effects are surprisingly good for 1927, and the story had me riveted. Grainy restored footage, subtitled title cards, and all. Also, if it's possible, Metropolis had an even crazier story than Le Voyage dans la Lune. At 2.5 hours, the original cut was considered too long for most audiences, and it had some material that people considered politically or religiously inappropriate. I don't regard it so at all by modern standards. So most of the distributions were almost immediately edited down to about 2 hours. And I remind you that this was Germany in 1927. A few years later, the Nazis showed up, and they forced the producers to cut even more. The new version was only an hour and a half, and despite its unfortunate origins and shredded storyline, it was the definitive version that everyone saw and still enjoyed for most of the 20th century. But today, you can see the original cut. After 20 years of painstaking work, looking in archives and museums around the world for mere fragments of the original version, like they did for Voyage dans la Lune, or even just original scripts because they didn't even know what order to put the scenes in, a full-length copy was discovered in Argentina in 2008. Suddenly, they had everything, or nearly everything. 2 short scenes were too damaged to be usable, but it still restored over 96% of the original cut. And soon, the world was treated to the complete Metropolis that hadn't been seen since 1927, with a new recording of the official score. So, as you can probably see, the early film era could get pretty crazy. We'll be coming back to movies when we get to the space age. For now, just keep in mind how they opened up new modes of expression for the genre, and even at this early stage, had a significant influence on culture. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts, plus YouTube, and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. My movie recommendation for the episode, if you couldn't tell, is Metropolis. Seriously, this is an amazing film. I do want to make a note about the rating. The film is not rated in the United States, but most countries rate it at the equivalent of PG-13. That's probably because of the themes and some very risque costumes. But that's only on a few minor background characters. I do think a PG-13 rating would be fair. I only mention it because I try to warn about content in this podcast where it's appropriate. It's a really good movie, and you can rent it online pretty cheap, so I highly recommend you check it out. In the next episode, it's back into literature with some of the few genre books that managed to get published as single volumes before the 1950s. These are the classic dystopias like 1984, along with some others that you might not have heard so much about. Thanks for listening.